She said, I'm here for talent identification. It's not selling my product. I'm here to identify people who we need in our industry in the next decade or so. That's a smart woman and a smart organization, because that competition is going to grow and grow and grow. A friend of mine who's an economist said, Rick, you've got to realize there's never going to be a labor shortage. And I said, yeah, but can you stand the consequences? Can you stand the offshoring? Can you stand the firms moving out? Can you stand the firms bidding up labor? Can you stand the firms replacing labor with technology? You're probably right. There may not be one, but the consequences are far, far worse. When you have higher and higher levels of unemployment, more and more social services being required, and less economic growth to support them. Okay, for retaining people, good HR policies. I've already talked about the training. Talk about a couple surveys for the 65 and older. This is a U.S. survey that surveyed the baby boomers, and here's what they said when asked, what is your ideal post-retirement situation? 42% said, I want cyclical work. And you're saying, what is that? I'll come back to it. 17% said, I never want to work again in my life. 16% said, I'll do part-time work. 13% I'll start my own business. 6% said full-time, 6% undecided. The 42% is basically, I want to work when I want to work. Right? And maybe I want to work for a year and take 6 months off. And maybe I want to work Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Or maybe I only want to work mornings. Or maybe I want more control over my life. Still want to work, still want to make a contribution, but want to have more control. May make sense if you don't have people to fill the jobs, and that's your well-trained workforce that's exiting. So let's look at Canadian data. 63% of, and this again is the boomers, these are the Canadian baby boomers. 63% want to be accommodated some way post-retirement, but only half of the employers are willing to do that. 34% want to ease into retirement, but only 21% of the employers want them to do that. 64% say they have difficulty talking to their employer about retirement. So 2/3 of your workforce has something in their mind about what they're going to do, and you as an employer have no idea because you're not talking to each other. That's a recipe for some real problems. 33% say that they would allow older workers to stay past retirement, and most of the older workers probably want to spend another 5 years past retirement. Some more than 5, but the bulk 5. So in order to recycle that group, we need better retirement plans, some earlier discussion about retirement options, and the nature of post-retirement is going to change. So the time for planning and analysis is now. As I've alluded to earlier, the U.S. is in the identical situation, and I don't have them now. The charts for Australia are virtually the same. Japan is worse. Europe is harder because of the EU. There's far more labor mobility in Europe than either U.S., Canada, or Australia, but the U.S. is in the same, if not worse, situation. So that's what we've got. We've got jobs without people and people without jobs. We've got about a year to do something. If we don't do it, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. So I thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to dialoguing.
All right, we have some very comfortable chairs up here, sofa, but your job is to make sure that they're not too comfortable, because now we're moving into the dialogue. And we're going to welcome to the stage here Mark Rivers. Mark Rivers is the founder and CEO of PEO, Presidents of Enterprising Organizations. He is a pioneer in the concept of peer group leadership development. Mark is described by his peers and business associates as an exceptional leader and mentor. He's worked with over 2,000 senior executives during his 20-plus years in teaching senior executives to think creatively through an open conversation as individual leaders or as leaders in their respective organizations. Today, Mark is involved in leadership roles in several Canadian as well as international companies. He is the founder of Breakthrough Growth Corporation and CEO Capital, companies focused on driving enhanced organizational growth through groundbreaking strategic thinking and execution. So, for the next little while, we'll be in Mark's hands. We'll welcome Rick back to the comfortable seating here, and then it's over to you. So, Mark, please welcome Mark and Rick back to the stage.
Thanks, Tony. Nice to meet you all. We've got the unenviable job of dealing and having an interactive conversation while you've just had a steak. I was asked just recently to chair this panel discussion with Rick, and as you know, my background and where I spend my time is in business. It's in leadership learning as a part of it. But I wondered what can I do, or what would I contribute around literacy. But as I listened to Rick's presentation and listened to some of the discussion and read some of the background, I thought there are some interesting things that we can talk about, especially when we think about the community that's represented here. We've got at least four different communities represented. We have government, we have industry, we have education, and we have labor. And one of the dinner table conversations we had is that these four communities have some very different values, very different focus. And one of the things that I find in business is it's very challenging is how do you get different groups, just take a management team, finance, marketing, management, to align when they're all different. The finance person is a bit the conservative person, the marketer and the sales guy wants to make it happen, and operations and that. And we've got the same sort of thing here. And the theory that, the principle I think that struck me is two things, maybe three. Math was not my major, so. One is that one of our biggest challenges as a group in dealing with what Rick has presented tonight is the tendency to want to organize the data into a nice orderly fashion. If I can give you some interesting reading, is David Snowden's work around decisions in a complex environment. And the challenge that we have is when we get new data that's being presented and discussed like this, is how do you process it and interpret it and come up with a solution that's actually working. And I thought of the movie, if you haven't seen it, is Aviator. Who saw the movie Aviator with Howard Hughes? It's a fabulous movie on a bunch of different levels, but the thing that struck me that's relevant to this is the people showcased in that time struck me as those people shaped the business and economic engine and wealth creation for the last 100 years. I think we're in that setting again today. And so what I would like to have a little bit of discussion and engage Rick in is two or three questions. One is, how do you align the four communities here? What is the purpose? Is literacy the objective in and of itself? The tendency is when we get into something and we choose what we're doing, that becomes the end in itself. So, Rick, if you could weigh in on that, right, and then we'll go from there.
Let me make a couple comments and then see where the dialogue goes. I mean, my view is my reality is the problem is so big that no one of those four sectors can solve this problem. It's too big and it'll come too fast. And it's so multidimensional, taking on your quote, that it's really going to need a concerted effort by all players to do things differently than they've done before. And I have to admit, and as I said earlier in the evening, the nice thing about being retired is you don't have to be too polite about what you say. The educational system, and more specifically the universities, have not been as responsive as I think they should be to the needs of society, to the needs of government. They have a paradigm that has been more or less shaped since the 1970s. Because if you go back to the 1970s, what you realize is about 10% of the population was going to university. Now it's about 30-some% of the population. When 10% went, they went for a reason very different than what 30% go for now. And yet the paradigm hasn't shifted to accommodate a closer focus between education and employment. The businesses don't come off clean either. If you look historically at the amount of money that businesses invested into workplace training, it's been an embarrassment. It's been an embarrassment from a Canadian context, whether you compared us to the US or elsewhere in the world. And I think there was this inappropriate assumption that society had the role of training people to do the jobs that they needed to be done. And I just don't think that holds anymore. Just make sure everybody comes off with a bit of a scar. I think we're starting to see some movement on the union side, but I think there's still a tendency to hold on to the past when there's an evolving future that probably needs different relationships. And that's not to say we shouldn't be doing things, but rather that we should be thinking about how unions and business and education can align more. And then down to your question about literacy, I think the thing you got to keep in mind is literacy is not the end. Right? Literacy is simply the beginning of a lifelong process. And I think at times the goal is defined as literacy. And that's not right. Literacy is an avenue to something else. And whether it's to further education or whether it's to employment or whether it's to eliminate some social issues, I think we got to think beyond that and recognize that it's a way to something else, and making sure that we build those connections into our education and training processes.
And I'd like to build on that conversation of literacy too, because I think we're in a time, and I mentioned that I think we're in a season here where you're seeing the technology, labor, the global, all of the influences that we've heard talked about so much, driving significant changes in the way we create wealth today, the way our economic system. And I'm wondering if there's room for a redefinition of, or an expansion of the definition of literacy too. You'd mentioned in your presentation the cultural influences.
You look at literacy, and I think the thing we've got to be cognizant of is that I think literacy, what is literate depends on where you are and what you're doing. I mean, I don't think there's one definition. I think there's variable. For example, if you're in Toronto, I would have thought multicultural understanding becomes an element of literacy. There may be other parts of the country where that's not the case. If I'm in certain occupations, then other types of factors come into place. If we use HRSDC's kind of 9 employability skills, there's a continued debate on is 9 the right number, and if not, do the 9 in fact shift a bit depending on where you are?
The other thing we were talking about is I suppose I'll step back just a moment. You're all very passionate in here about the whole notion of literacy. What I was trying to think, how can we drive some different thoughts that maybe you haven't considered in this brief 10 minutes that we've got? And we were sitting at the table, and actually we had a very interesting representation around the table. We had not-for-profit, we had government, we had education, and we had business. And one of the things I do on the strategy side is often talk about how collaboration works. And the example I like is, as an Anglo province, you often hear the Quebec model being cheating, the ability to be able to collaborate with government.